case of the Grimes sisters. Barbara Jean Grimes was born May 5th, 1941. Patricia Kathleen Grimes was born December 31st, 1943. They were 2 of 7 children. Their mother, Loretta, was raising them. Their father, who I think his name was maybe James, I'm not 100% sure, he wasn't living with them at the time. And they lived in the McKinley Park area of Chicago. On December the 28th, 1956, 15-year-old Barbara and 12-year-old Patricia went to Brighton Theater in Brighton Park to see Elvis's Love Me Tender. Now, the girls were obsessed with Elvis. This was the 11th time, I believe, they had seen the movie, but they absolutely adored Elvis and wanted to see the movie again. They left home about 7:30 that night, and they promised to be home before midnight. And that was definitely going to be easy to do because the theater was only like a mile and a half from their home. So it was really close to where they lived. And there was even a bus that ran from there. So, I mean, it would, be very easy for them to get there and to get back home. They left home with about $2.50 together. And they were supposed to save, I think, 50 cents of that. So if they wanted to see a second showing of the movie that played later that night, they could. Now, at the movie theater, a friend of the family sat behind the sisters, and she ended up leaving the theater at about 9:30. And she said that when she left the theater, the girls were in line to get popcorn. So they were playing, they were joking around. They seemed to be in good spirits. They weren't talking to any strange people. They seemed normal. Everything seemed fine. And the girls did end up staying for the second viewing. And so they expected to be home by 11:45. That's when their mother expected them. And when they didn't return by midnight, Loretta sent her son Joey, who was younger than Barbara but a little older than Patricia, and her daughter Teresa, who was older than both girls, to the bus stop that was down the road from their home to wait and hopefully, escort the girls home if they had ended up catching a bus. And while they were gone, Loretta called, checked, to see if the girls were at friends' houses or whatever. And so when Teresa and Joey returned home about 2:15 a.m. without the girls, Loretta called the police. And the missing persons investigation that happened for the Grimes sisters was one of the biggest missing person cases in Cook County history. It was absolutely massive. There were not only local police, but other districts were there. There were, obviously locals. People just really wanted to find these girls. And so they started searching around places that the girls could potentially be. And eventually the number of officers assigned to the case was in the hundreds, and that was for full time. Like, that was all these officers did from the time they got to work till the time they went home, was research and investigate this case. They formed a task force. They walked door to door. They had the canals and the rivers dragged. They created about 15,000 missing persons posters. The church that the girls went to offered a $1,000 reward. And eventually there was close to 300,000 people interviewed or interrogated. And originally there were about 2,000 of those 300,000 interrogations that they did that they thought could lead to more. So those people were kind of considered potential suspects. And unfortunately, there was little evidence. I mean, there weren't really signs of a struggle or anything. But they did manage to find some witnesses that saw the girls get into a Mercury with a young boy that looked a lot like Elvis. And there seems to be a pretty good police response later on in the investigation. But for the first week or so, the police kind of insisted that the girls were runaways, and so a lot of the efforts that were taken later in the case could have happened earlier if they hadn't been classified as runaways. And Elvis and Graceland even released statements asking the girls to come home because someone had contacted or let him know that the girls were big Elvis fans, and he thought if he made a plea to them to come home that they would do so. So a couple weeks passed, I believe it was about 3 weeks, and on the morning of January, I believe maybe the 17th, sounds correct, Leonard Prescott was driving down the road after a thaw had happened, and he spotted the girls' bodies behind the guardrail. And when he saw them, he thought they were mannequins. He went and picked up his wife, and they came back to the spot on German Church Road. And when she saw them, she immediately fainted because she, discovered that they were, in fact, not mannequins. The bodies were on top of an embankment. It was like a slope that led down to Devil's Creek. They were at the top of that slope. Patricia was laying over her sister, kind of in almost... it almost looked like she was kind of guarding Barbara. But it was later determined that the girls were probably driven there and then dumped. Barbara had blunt force trauma and ice pick-like stab wounds, and Patricia was badly bruised. Now, unfortunately, due to the weather conditions and the technology of the time, and lack of evidence, no conclusive time of death or cause of death were determined. But stomach contents led pathologists, I believe there are 5 pathologists that worked together on the case. It led them to believe that the girls had died about 5 hours after having been seen at Brighton. And if that is true, because there are conflicting reports there, but if that was true, then the girls would have died late on December the 28th or early on December the 29th. And official cause of death was listed as shock and exposure. And they stated that most of the stab wounds appeared to have been actually rodent bite marks that had been inflicted post-mortem. Toxicology was clean. There was no alcohol or drugs in the girls' systems. Both bodies were nude, but they were incredibly clean. Barbara had either consensual or non-consensual sex prior to death, but there was no evidence of sexual trauma or forced penetration. Now, I said earlier that a lot of the reports differ. One of the major differences is chief investigator for the coroner at the time, Harry Gloss, stated that the girls would have had to have been alive for several days afterwards because they had been beaten, and he said that they had been sexually assaulted. And he also claimed that Barbara had curdled milk in her system, and the girls didn't have milk at the movie theater or at home that night that they disappeared, and that Patricia had semen on and in her body. And he stated that the way the ice had formed on the bodies meant that the girls had to have been placed there around January the 7th, which is about a week after the official report. Gloss was later fired from the coroner's office, but there have been some detectives that do believe his story. So, I mean, it's believable, but in cases like this, it's kind of hard to know since the official... Alright, let's get into the suspects. There's 3 main ones. Edward Bedwell, who we discussed before. He was a 21-year-old drifter who looked a lot like Elvis. He was spotted with 2 girls the day after their abduction, and a lot of people said that it was the Grimes sisters, but Edward claimed that it wasn't. But he was the person that was seen with potentially the girls at the diner. He eventually confessed, but then he recanted. His confession, the evidence doesn't fit it. And he was also at work. He has a solid alibi. The next suspect is Max Flagg. He was 17 and he confessed. He's not, to me, a major suspect because none of the evidence fits him, and he also wasn't charged with the crime because there was no evidence. The last suspect was Walter Kranz. He was a 53-year-old, quote-unquote, psychic, and he called in a tip telling where the bodies would be found. And the location that they were found was very close to where he had predicted. He claimed that he had had a vision and that he was, wanted to report it to help the girls. His handwriting was a close match to a note that had eventually been sent to Loretta, but he was never charged. There wasn't enough evidence. And so of those 3, to me, Kranz looks the most guilty, but I'm not sold on any of them. The truth is, I don't know that there is a solid suspect in this case yet. I'm hoping that one day there will be, but for now it doesn't seem likely. Alright guys, that's the case of the Grimes sisters. Barbara Jean Grimes was born May 5th, 1941. Patricia Kathleen Grimes was born December 31st, 1943. They were